The training ground stretched out under the late afternoon sun, the air vibrating with the dry hum of cicadas and the faint metallic clatter of rifles being checked along the shooting line. A row of soldiers stood at attention, boots aligned with military precision, waiting for the next order. At the far end, a steel target painted white shimmered in the heat haze, its bullseye almost invisible at such a distance. Whispers floated through the ranks, an undercurrent of skepticism and smug certainty, because they all knew the unspoken truth: nobody here could split the bullseye. The challenge was outrageous, a shot designed more for legend than reality. "No one can hit that," a tall Navy SEAL officer had said with an easy smirk, his tone heavy with the confidence of a man who had seen combat and trusted his experience to shield him from doubt. He leaned on his rifle like it was an extension of his body, eyes narrowing as if daring anyone to prove him wrong. Yet all the rifles lowered one by one, each man silently acknowledging that the shot was absurd. All except for one woman who stood at the back, her presence nearly invisible until the silence seemed to shift toward her. She didn't belong here, not in their eyes. Not in the eyes of the men who had bled through years of training, who carried their scars like medals, who believed skill on the battlefield was carved by fire and not born by chance. To them, she was just a civilian, a woman whose plain clothes and calm expression carried none of the hardened edges of combat. Her hands were steady but soft, her posture graceful but unassuming. They thought of her as an observer at best, a distraction at worst. Yet when her gaze moved from the officer to the distant bullseye, it carried a sharpness that cut through the afternoon haze like glass. She asked for no permission, no acknowledgement. She simply stepped forward, her movements fluid and precise, as though the weight of their doubt rolled off her shoulders without leaving a mark. The SEAL officer chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as if indulging a child's fantasy. "You think you can do better?" he asked, the words carrying that familiar edge of condescension soldiers often wield against outsiders. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the rifle lying untouched at the edge of the bench, her fingers wrapping around the weapon with the easy familiarity of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. The onlookers shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to step into their world and touch their tools of war as though she had the right. But she did. She checked the chamber with a snap of efficiency, adjusted the scope with a practiced hand, and lowered herself into position with a grace that spoke of discipline rather than improvisation. Her breathing slowed, her shoulders loosening as she settled against the rifle like a pianist easing into the bench before striking the first note. The SEAL officer's grin faltered just slightly when he noticed her posture. It wasn't clumsy, it wasn't hesitant. She lay prone with the rifle in a textbook stance, elbows locked into the earth, cheek pressed against the stock as though the rifle itself had been waiting for her. For the first time, a murmur of curiosity rippled through the men who had, until then, carried only laughter and doubt in their expressions. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, but she didn't rush. Instead, she breathed once, twice, 3 times, each exhale slower than the last, her body syncing with the invisible rhythm of the wind and the world. The range fell silent. The cicadas seemed to vanish, the sun seemed to pause, and even the officer who had scoffed at her found his smile frozen halfway between arrogance and unease. In that silence the shot cracked. A sharp, decisive thunder that echoed off the hills and rolled back toward them like a drumbeat of inevitability. The target quivered under the strike, and when the binoculars came down, the murmurs turned into a stunned hush. Dead center. Not near, not grazing, not an approximation. The bullet had buried itself into the very heart of the bullseye, as though the steel itself had bent to her will. But the silence didn't come from the accuracy alone. It came from the impossibility that followed. A second shot, fired before anyone had the chance to process the first, split the first bullet in two. The bullseye wasn't just hit. It was shattered, the steel scarred by precision so absolute that disbelief fought against the evidence of their own eyes. For a long moment no one moved. The soldiers stared at her with a mix of awe and fear, as if the ground beneath them had shifted without warning. The SEAL officer, once confident and untouchable, lowered his gaze to the earth, his grin gone, replaced by the tightness of a man realizing he had underestimated something beyond his comprehension. The woman rose calmly, brushing the dust from her hands, her face as composed as it had been before she ever touched the rifle. She didn't revel in the shock around her, didn't smile at their open mouths or their stunned silence. She only placed the rifle back on the bench with quiet respect, as though the act itself was nothing extraordinary. But her silence spoke louder than any boast could have. It said, "You doubted me and you were wrong." It said, "Skill isn't bound by the limits of your imagination." It said, I am here and I belong whether you admit it or not. The general, who had been watching from a distance with folded arms and an expression carved from stone, finally stepped forward. His boots crunched against the gravel, drawing every gaze toward him. He had seen countless men claim glory, seen arrogance rise and fall, but rarely had he seen humility paired with a mastery so complete it silenced a crowd. He studied her not with skepticism but with calculation, the kind of look a commander gives when recognizing a weapon he hadn't realized he needed. Around him, the murmurs began again, softer this time, tinged with awe instead of dismissal. The SEAL officer shifted uncomfortably, as though hoping the earth might swallow him before he had to admit the truth that now hung heavy in the air. And the woman, still silent, simply lifted her gaze from the target to the horizon. For her, the bullseye wasn't the end, it was the beginning. The silence that followed her shot stretched into minutes, broken only by the faint groan of metal from the distant target swaying in the wind. The men on the line still stared at her as though she had performed sorcery rather than marksmanship, their disbelief feeding into an unease none of them wanted to admit aloud. 4 warriors defined by their strength and precision, watching an outsider, worse, a woman they had dismissed without thought, achieve the impossible carved at their pride like a blade. The SEAL officer's jaw tightened as he replayed the moment in his head, trying to rationalize it, trying to convince himself it had been luck, a trick, a coincidence. Yet deep down, beneath layers of arrogance and muscle memory, he knew what he had seen. Luck could not replicate the calm control she had shown, nor could coincidence split steel with a second shot fired before hesitation could take root. He wanted to sneer, to reclaim his authority with words, but his tongue weighed heavy in his mouth. Beside him, younger soldiers whispered, their voices edged with something new, respect. The general reached her first. His shadow stretched long across the gravel as he approached, his eyes locked on hers with the unflinching intensity of a man who had commanded on battlefields where hesitation cost lives. She stood still, meeting his gaze without lowering her own, though she offered no salute, no words. He circled her slowly, not as a predator sizing up prey, but as a commander appraising a weapon. Sleek, silent, effective. Where did you learn that? His voice carried across the ground, sharp and demanding, the kind of voice that expected obedience. The woman didn't flinch. Nowhere you'd know, she said quietly, but with enough clarity that every man within earshot caught her words. It wasn't arrogance that filled her tone, nor defiance. It was truth spoken plainly without ornament. The general's eyes narrowed, studying her with renewed focus, his instincts telling him she wasn't bluffing. He had seen men fabricate stories of impossible shots, watched egos crumble under scrutiny, but this was different. She didn't seek recognition. She didn't crave their approval. She had shown them her skill and that was enough. The SEAL officer finally found his voice, sharp and laced with anger meant to mask humiliation. That doesn't prove anything, he snapped, his words cutting across the still air. 1 shot, even 2, doesn't make you a sniper. You couldn't replicate that under pressure, not in the field, not with lives depending on it. The words were meant as a dismissal, but they trembled slightly, betraying his own unease. The woman turned her head toward him, her expression unreadable. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself with boasts or empty challenges. Instead, she simply said, "Set it up." The officer blinked, caught off guard. "What?" he demanded. She repeated, calm and steady, "Set it up. The conditions, the pressure, whatever you think proves it. I'll shoot." Her words struck the line of soldiers like sparks to dry tinder, igniting whispers and startled glances. The audacity of her challenge wasn't in its boldness, but in its simplicity. She wasn't demanding to be believed. She was inviting them to test her. The general's lips twitched, almost into a smile, though his expression remained iron-hard. "Very well," he said, his voice low, decisive. He gestured to the officer. "Do as she asks. Set the test." The officer stiffened, his pride trapped between refusal and obedience. He couldn't back down now without losing face, and the men around him knew it. He barked orders, his voice sharp as he directed the range crew to move targets farther out, to position them at odd angles, to scatter them across terrain where wind and cover conspired against accuracy. The soldiers moved quickly, dragging steel targets across gravel, planting them into hillsides, setting them at distances few dared to attempt outside simulation. By the time the setup was finished, the sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. The air shifted cooler, but the tension grew heavier, pressing on every chest like a weight. When the officer turned back, his expression carried a sneer born of desperation. "You'll shoot 5 targets," he said, his tone clipped. Different distances, different angles, and you'll have only 30 seconds to hit them all. No time to line up perfect shots. No second chances. That's what real snipers face. His words were meant to intimidate, to expose her as an amateur once the clock began ticking. The soldiers nodded, some smirking, others watching with sharpened curiosity, eager to see if she could live up to her impossible feat. The woman only adjusted the strap of her jacket, then lay down beside the rifle once more, her movements smooth, unhurried. She asked for no explanation, no adjustment time, no indulgence. She simply waited, eyes focused on the horizon, as though already measuring wind and distance, already solving the puzzle laid before her. The officer raised his hand, then dropped it. "Go!" he barked, and the countdown began. 30 seconds. The first shot cracked almost instantly, the echo thundering across the hills. One target down. Before the sound had finished rolling, the second shot came, and the second target shuddered, a plume of dust rising behind it. The crowd leaned forward, disbelieving, as her hands moved with mechanical precision, her body flowing in perfect rhythm with the rifle. Third shot, fourth shot, fifth, each one a thunderbolt that struck steel dead on, each impact timed like notes in a flawless composition. By the time the officer shouted, "Stop!" she had already lowered the rifle, the smoke curling from the barrel as though exhaling triumph. The silence that followed was thicker than before. It wasn't the stunned disbelief of a single bullseye, nor the awe of a lucky second. It was the silence of men who had just witnessed proof, undeniable, absolute, beyond question. The officer's face drained of color, his chest rising and falling with the sharp breath of someone caught between rage and humiliation. Around him, the younger soldiers who had smirked now stared at the woman with wide eyes, as though they were looking at something not entirely human. The general stepped forward once again, his boots steady, his gaze locked on her with something new burning behind his eyes. Possibility. "Name," he demanded, not unkindly but with the authority of a man who knew what he wanted. She paused for a moment, then answered with a single word, her voice calm and unwavering. "Elena." It was the first time most of them had heard her name, and it settled over them like a promise. Elena didn't need their approval. She didn't need their disbelief. She had carved her truth into steel, and it would not be forgotten. The name lingered in the air, simple yet commanding, as if the syllables themselves carried weight. Elena. The soldiers repeated it in their minds, attaching it now not to an anonymous woman, but to the figure who had humiliated arrogance and carved impossible precision into their memory. The general studied her with a gaze that betrayed little, yet in the tightness of his jaw and the slow nod of his head, there was acknowledgment, not just of skill but of potential. He turned to the SEAL officer, whose pride was bleeding openly across his face, and said flatly, "Dismissed." The officer bristled, his body stiffening in protest, but one look from the general silenced him. With clenched fists he stepped back, his authority shattered, reduced now to a spectator. The other men straightened instinctively, the hierarchy of the field shifting without a word spoken. Elena, the woman they had dismissed as nothing, now stood at the center of gravity, and no one could deny it. But Elena herself remained unshaken by their shifting regard. She didn't bask in the stunned glances or the whispered murmurs of respect. Instead, she moved with quiet efficiency, returning the rifle to the table, brushing dust from her sleeves, her composure as unyielding as stone. Her calm was unnerving. Soldiers thrived on noise, the clash of words, the stomp of boots, the thunder of drills. She thrived on silence, and in that silence she was untouchable. The general watched her for a long moment, then asked, "Who taught you?" His tone was not demanding this time, but genuinely curious. Elena hesitated before answering. "My father," she said simply, though her eyes flickered briefly, betraying a history deeper than she was willing to unveil. That flicker was enough to spark curiosity in the men around her, who leaned closer as though proximity might grant them pieces of her secret. But Elena offered no more. She didn't owe them her story. She had given them her skill, and that was all they needed. The general turned sharply, addressing his aide in a clipped voice. "File her name. Get her records." His orders crackled through the air like electricity. The aide saluted and hurried off, though confusion lingered in his eyes, confusion over what records they would even find on a woman who appeared from nowhere, who carried no insignia, no uniform, no past within their ranks. The SEAL officer, unable to contain himself, sneered bitterly. "You can't be serious. She doesn't belong here. She's not one of us." His voice carried desperation now, the last grip of a drowning man clinging to his pride. The general didn't look at him. "She belongs wherever her skill places her," he said coldly, his tone leaving no room for argument. The officer's protest died in his throat, choked by the weight of finality. Elena's eyes, however, remained fixed on the distant targets. She didn't ask for a place among them, didn't fight for recognition. She seemed indifferent to the general's orders, as though the weight of their approval or dismissal had no bearing on her purpose. For her, the Bullseye was not about proving herself to them, it was about proving herself to something far larger. A ghost from her past, a shadow of expectation, perhaps even the memory of the man who had first placed a rifle in her hands. Every shot she fired carried whispers of that past, each one binding her to a promise unseen by the soldiers who now surrounded her. As the sun slipped further toward the horizon, the general gave a final order. Tomorrow at dawn, she shoots again. The declaration was final, not a request but a command that carried with it a quiet storm of implications. The men dispersed slowly, casting backward glances at Elena as though afraid to turn their backs entirely, as though she might carve another legend into steel the moment they looked away. The SEAL officer lingered longest, his stare venomous but powerless. His pride demanded revenge, yet his reason whispered that challenging her again might only deepen his humiliation. He turned on his heel and stalked away, muttering under his breath, his shadow stretching long and broken in the fading light. Elena remained where she was long after the others left. The silence of the empty range suited her. She walked slowly to the target, her boots crunching over gravel, and when she reached it, she ran her fingers along the torn steel. The jagged edges of the split bullet were sharp, but she didn't flinch. Instead, her touch lingered, as though reading the story her shots had written into the metal. To anyone else it was proof of her skill. To her it was something more intimate, a conversation with her father, a reminder of countless hours spent under his watchful eye, learning not just how to shoot but how to see. He had taught her that the target was never the enemy, the real enemy was hesitation, the doubt that lived between heartbeat and breath. And today she had silenced it. Night fell over the range, stars scattering across the sky like distant tracer fire. Elena sat on the edge of the bench, her rifle resting beside her, and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would not be like today. Today had been spectacle, a test of arrogance. Tomorrow she sensed would be different. The general's interest was not casual. He had plans, and those plans would drag her further into a world she had long avoided, a world of uniforms, orders, and chains of command. She had resisted that world once, choosing solitude over service, silence over obedience. But fate, it seemed, was not finished with her. She exhaled slowly, her breath fading into the night air, and whispered to herself words no one else would hear. This is only the beginning. The dawn broke cold and sharp, the kind of morning where the air felt like glass against the skin, brittle and unforgiving. The training ground was already alive with movement, soldiers marching into place, their boots thundering against the earth in practiced rhythm. The distant targets had been reset, new steel plates gleaming under the early sun, some placed at nearly impossible distances, others hidden behind obstacles meant to mimic battlefield cover. The range, which yesterday had been a stage for spectacle, now felt like a crucible. Every man present sensed that today was different. Yesterday had been defiance, today was trial. The general stood at the front, arms folded, his expression unyielding. Beside him, a cluster of senior officers whispered among themselves, their voices hushed but their eyes trained on the woman standing apart from the formation. Elena. Her name now passed through the ranks like a quiet current, no longer dismissed but carried with respect, curiosity, even fear. She stood with the same calm presence as before, her eyes not on the men nor the officers but on the range itself. She studied the targets with the precision of a cartographer mapping terrain, her gaze shifting from one steel plate to another, measuring distances, angles, the way the wind cut across the valley. Where the soldiers around her saw difficulty, she saw patterns, invisible lines connecting target to shooter, breath to trigger. The SEAL officer stood off to the side, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched. His humiliation from the day before still burned, but his silence told its own story. He had no more words, only the bitter hope that today's test would expose her limits. Yet even he, in the dark corner of his pride, could not silence the memory of her flawless shots, nor the gnawing suspicion that limits were something she had long ago shattered. The general's voice carried across the ground, low but heavy with authority. Today you will demonstrate again, he said, his eyes fixed on Elena. Not one shot. Not 5. 20. 20 targets at 20 distances. 2 minutes. A ripple of disbelief spread through the ranks. Even seasoned snipers balked at such a demand. It wasn't just skill, It was speed, instinct, the kind of test that stripped a shooter bare, leaving no room for hesitation or error. The officers muttered among themselves, some shaking their heads, certain the demand was too great, designed to break her. Elena did not argue, did not question. She gave a single nod, as though the general had asked nothing extraordinary. The clock was set. Soldiers dragged the targets into position, some angled behind rocks, others placed far into the distance where even the scope barely caught their outlines. The atmosphere thickened with tension, every man waiting for her to falter, for proof that she was mortal after all. Elena stepped forward, picking up the rifle with the same deliberate care as before, checking its chamber, adjusting its scope, her movements smooth, precise, free of waste. She lay prone, shoulders loose, breathing slow. The general raised his hand. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath with him. Then his hand dropped. Begin. The first shot cracked, then the second, then the third. Her rhythm was faster now, each shot flowing into the next like water cascading over stone. Soldiers strained their eyes, trying to track her targets, but the sound of steel ringing echoed again and again, a relentless cadence that left no doubt. 10 seconds in, 5 targets down. 30 seconds in, 10. The officers who had doubted now leaned forward unconsciously, their disbelief eroding under the weight of undeniable precision. Dust plumed from the hillsides, steel quivered under impact, and still she moved without hesitation. Her body and rifle were one machine, breath and trigger synchronized with impossible timing. When the final second ticked away, the last shot cracked, its echo rolling across the range like thunder. Silence followed, the kind of silence that pressed on every ear until it felt like a roar. The tally was called. 20 targets. 20 strikes. Not one miss. Not one delay. The general's jaw tightened, his face unreadable, but his eyes burned with recognition. The SEAL officer stood rigid, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles blanched white, unable to deny what he had witnessed. Around them, the soldiers shifted, their whispers hushed not by disbelief this time but by reverence. Elena had not just passed the test, she had redefined it. She rose slowly, brushing dust from her arms, placing the rifle back with the same respect she had shown before. Her expression remained calm, but within her chest, her heart beat steady, strong. This was not triumph for her. This was confirmation that what her father had taught her still lived within her, that every lesson carved in long hours and harder days had not faded. She thought of him in that moment, not with sorrow, but with the quiet pride of carrying his legacy forward. The general stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. He stopped just a pace away, studying her with eyes that had seen countless warriors, countless battles. His voice was softer this time, but no less commanding. "You're wasted outside the uniform," he said. "You belong with us." The weight of the words hung heavy. It was not invitation but inevitability. Elena met his gaze, her eyes steady, though her silence spoke volumes. She had walked away from this world once, choosing solitude over command, silence over war. Yet here it was again, reaching for her, dragging her back into its orbit. She inhaled, exhaled, her decision unspoken, but in the fire of her eyes, the general saw what he needed to see. She would not break. She would not falter. And whether she wore the uniform or not, she was already a weapon in their arsenal. The rest of the camp buzzed with whispers long after the demonstration ended, but Elena paid them little mind. She walked alone back toward the barracks that had been hastily offered to her, the murmurs of men trailing behind like shadows she didn't invite. Inside, the room was sparse, a cot, a metal locker, a single chair. It reminded her of places she had abandoned years ago, the kind of rooms where silence became both companion and curse. She sat on the edge of the cot, elbows on her knees, staring at the floor as the weight of the day pressed into her. The shots she fired had not drained her, they had sharpened her. What wore her down was the inevitability of what came next. She had not sought this stage, had not asked for generals or SEALs or soldiers to witness her skill. Yet now she stood at the center of their gaze, and she knew what men like the general saw when they looked at her. A weapon to be wielded, a force to be aimed. She clenched her hands slowly as though testing her own resolve, and reminded herself of the promise she had made long ago. She had sworn never to let others write her story again. The knock on her door was sharp, commanding. She did not answer, but the door opened anyway. The general stepped inside without hesitation, closing the door behind him. He didn't waste words. "You've proven what I needed to see," he said, his tone even but heavy with purpose. Elena didn't move, her eyes still fixed on the floor. "And now you want me," she replied quietly, though her voice carried no surprise. The general nodded once. The world is changing. Enemies evolve. We need shooters who can do what others cannot. You can. His words were simple, direct, but beneath them lay an unspoken truth. Refusal was not truly an option. She looked up at him then, her gaze sharp, steady. You don't know me, she said, her voice soft but firm. You don't know what I've lost. For a brief moment, something flickered across his expression, something almost human beneath the steel. Maybe not, he admitted. But I know what you can do. And that's enough. The silence stretched between them, taut as wire. Elena broke it first, standing slowly, her presence measured. You think skill is enough, she said, her words deliberate. But skill without reason is just blood spilled without end. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her of nights spent under the stars, when he had spoken of purpose beyond the trigger. She carried those words like armor, though she never spoke them aloud. The general studied her carefully, then inclined his head. Then give it reason, he said simply before turning toward the door. You have until dawn to decide. And with that, he left, his boots fading down the corridor, leaving her alone with the echo of choice. The night was long, filled with ghosts. Elena lay on the cot but did not sleep. Memories threaded through her mind, her father's weathered hands guiding hers along a rifle stock, his voice steady as he taught her to control breath, to trust silence, to see not just with her eyes but with her entire being. She remembered the day he left and did not return, swallowed by a war that cared nothing for names or promises. She remembered the hollow ache of waiting, the silence that became her only companion. It was in that silence she had vowed never to be a tool for others, never to let herself be pulled into battles that erased humanity. Yet here she was, the weight of a uniform already pressing on her shoulders though she hadn't put it on. She turned to the window, staring at the stars scattered across the black, and wondered if her father would be proud, or if he would warn her to walk away. At dawn, the decision was waiting for her like the sun rising over the range. She rose, her movements slow but sure, and stepped outside into the cold morning air. The general was already there, standing with a small group of officers, his eyes fixed on her as though he had known she would come. The SEAL officer lurked at the edge of the gathering, bitterness carved into every line of his face. Elena walked forward, each step measured, until she stood before them. The general's voice broke the silence. Well, he asked. Elena inhaled deeply, the chill burning in her lungs. I'll shoot, she said, her words carrying both surrender and defiance. She wasn't joining them, not yet. She was choosing to fire, to prove herself again, but on her terms. The general gave a single nod, as though that was all he needed. The next test was different. Not a range this time, but a simulation. Moving targets, shifting terrain, conditions meant to mimic the chaos of combat. The soldiers gathered again, their eyes hungry, eager to see whether her skill could stretch beyond still steel and perfect conditions. The SEAL officer smirked, convinced this time the chaos would expose her. Elena picked up the rifle, the familiar weight grounding her, and moved into position. The first target appeared, darting out from behind cover. The shot rang out, precise. The second emerged at an angle, and again her bullet found its mark. Each new challenge was met with the same unshakable rhythm, her body moving as though guided by instinct older than thought. Dust kicked, echoes rolled, and one by one the targets fell. By the end, the range was silent once more, the simulation's chaos reduced to stillness under her precision. Elena lowered her rifle, her breathing even, her eyes steady. The soldiers stood in awe, the officers exchanging glances heavy with unspoken agreement. The general stepped forward, his voice low but certain. You don't belong outside anymore, he said. You belong here. With us. Elena said nothing, but inside she felt the old walls of resistance shifting, cracking under the weight of inevitability. The path she had tried to avoid was opening again before her, and though she didn't yet step onto it, she knew the choice would come sooner than she wanted. The days that followed blurred into one another, a rhythm of tests and demonstrations that grew harsher with each sunrise. Elena found herself pushed into situations designed not just to measure her skill, but to break her will. She was handed unfamiliar rifles, stripped of scopes, told to shoot at distances where the naked eye barely distinguished shapes from shadows. Targets moved unpredictably, some springing from cover, others slipping into the wind-swept haze of dusk. She was timed, pressured, shouted at, her every movement scrutinized by officers eager to find a crack in her precision. Yet time after time she delivered. Her shots carved through their doubts with surgical consistency, steel plates ringing with the certainty of inevitability. Each success deepened the awe of the soldiers, who now spoke her name not with skepticism but with reverence. Elena was no longer the woman on the range. She was Elena, the sniper who split steel, the shooter who defied limits. But awe came with a price. Respect grew heavy, turning into expectation. Every eye followed her, every whisper carried the weight of legend, and Elena felt the quiet chains of their belief tightening around her. She had never asked for this. She had never sought to become a figure others leaned on. Yet as the general watched from a distance, his arms crossed and his expression sharp with calculation, she understood what he intended. She was not just to be tested, she was to be forged. The SEAL officer, however, seethed silently. His pride, already battered, now found itself buried under the growing respect Elena commanded. He could not compete with her precision, and it tore at him. His smirk had long since faded, replaced by the hollow stare of a man watching his authority slip away grain by grain. He began to whisper in corners, planting seeds of doubt, speaking of how skill without loyalty was a danger, how Elena was an outsider, a ghost with no allegiance. One evening, after another grueling test that left even the instructors muttering about impossibility, Elena returned to her barracks to find him waiting at her door. His arms were folded, his expression hard, his jaw clenched with unspoken fury. She stopped a few paces away, her body still, her eyes steady on him. "You think this will last?" he hissed, his voice low, sharp with venom. "You think they'll keep you once they've used you up? You're nothing but a showpiece. A trick." Elena didn't answer immediately, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Finally she said, her tone flat, unshaken, "Steel doesn't care who pulls the trigger. It only answers to precision." The words cut sharper than any insult, and the officer's face darkened, rage simmering in his eyes. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "You'll slip. And when you do, I'll be there to watch you fall." Elena's gaze never wavered, her calm unbroken. "Then you'll be waiting a long time," she replied before brushing past him into her room, leaving him standing in the corridor, fists trembling. The general, meanwhile, saw none of this exchange, but he was no fool. He sensed the growing divide, the tension between pride and truth, between the old guard and the woman who had shattered their expectations. He didn't intervene. Instead, he allowed it to simmer, knowing that friction often revealed strength faster than comfort. His focus was not on the officer's wounded pride but on Elena's unyielding calm. He had commanded men his entire life, men who broke under fire, men who rose to greatness. Rarely had he seen someone who carried both skill and silence with equal weight. She was not just a marksman, she was discipline made flesh. He knew the world beyond their training ground was shifting, wars taking shape in shadows, conflicts waiting to ignite. And in Elena he saw not a tool but a blade, sharp, precise, and unlike any he had held before. The next trial stripped away even the illusion of control. Elena was taken before dawn, loaded onto a helicopter with no explanation, the roar of the rotors drowning out any questions she might have asked. They flew low over barren land, the horizon painted in hues of red and gold by the rising sun. When they landed, she stepped out into an abandoned village, its buildings shattered by time, its streets littered with silence. The general's voice crackled through a radio in her ear. "This is no range," he said. "This is the field. Targets will appear without warning. You have 1 hour." The simulation was no longer about distance or precision alone. It was about awareness, instinct, survival. Elena slung the rifle across her shoulder, her eyes sweeping the broken windows, the crumbling rooftops, the shifting dust. The village was a maze, a trap designed to test not just her accuracy, but her ability to see through chaos. The first target appeared in a second-story window, a flicker of movement against shadow. Her rifle snapped up, the shot cracking, the silhouette vanishing. Another darted between alleys, fast, erratic. She tracked it with a predator's calm, firing once, then again, each bullet stitching silence into the ruins. Targets came from rooftops, doorways, corners where dust concealed their forms. Elena moved with grace, her body flowing from cover to cover, her senses sharpened to the rhythm of the hunt. The village became alive with echoes of her fire, each crack of the rifle answered by the clang of steel or the collapse of plaster. Time blurred, her awareness stretching, her focus absolute. By the time the hour ended, the silence returned to the village, broken only by the faint hiss of wind through broken walls. Every target lay struck, every test answered. The general's voice returned, steady, almost reverent. "Report back," he said. Elena exhaled, lowering the rifle, her body calm though her heartbeat thundered in her chest. She looked around the village one last time, her eyes tracing the broken ruins, and realized something. This was not about proving herself anymore. This was about preparation. The general wasn't merely testing her limits. He was preparing her for something far beyond this village, something real, something coming. She should have felt fear, but instead she felt the familiar calm of her father's lessons echoing through her. The bullseye was never the enemy. The enemy was doubt. And she had none left. When Elena returned from the village, dust still clinging to her clothes and the faint echo of gunfire ringing in her ears, the camp received her not with doubt but with silence. Soldiers stood straighter as she passed, their conversations faltering, their gazes drawn toward her as though she carried the weight of something more than a rifle.